Ruthless Millionaire CEO threw orphans out of her building daily, until desperate 6-year-old walked in asking for any job to pay household bills. When she discovered the heartbreaking reason why, it destroyed her. From the 47th floor of the gleaming Stone Industries Tower in downtown Chicago, Margaret Stone pressed her manicured fingers against the cold glass window, watching with disgust as security guards brutally shoved a group of homeless children away from the building's entrance. At 40 years old, she was the epitome of corporate ruthlessness. Platinum blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, steel gray eyes that never showed mercy, and a designer suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Get those vermin away from my building," she barked into her phone, her voice cutting through the executive suite like a blade. Below, among the scattered children, a small blonde girl in tattered clothes caught her attention. The child couldn't be more than 8 years old, yet she kept returning day after day, making Margaret's stomach churn with an inexplicable rage that felt almost familiar. What the world didn't know was that Margaret Stone harbored a pathological fear of orphans, a terror so deep it had shaped 32 years of her existence. The trauma began when she was 8 years old, the same age as the persistent little girl below. That night in 1992, young Margaret had hidden in a closet, watching through a crack as masked criminals brutally murdered her parents, David and Linda Stone, in their family home. "Your parents died because they were weak," her uncle Richard Stone had whispered to her at the funeral, his weathered face stern and cold. "They wasted their lives helping those orphan brats, and look what it got them. Criminals connected to corrupt orphanages killed them, Margaret. Kindness is dangerous. It kills." Her Aunt Eleanor had nodded grimly, stroking Margaret's tear-stained cheek with cold fingers. "We'll teach you to be strong, darling. No more tears, no more weakness. The Stone family survives by being hard as our name. Helping orphans is what destroyed your parents." For 3 decades, Richard and Eleanor had methodically programmed Margaret into a money-making machine, convincing her that emotions were luxuries that led to death. Every act of coldness was praised, every hint of compassion crushed with reminders of her parents' bloody fate. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Margaret Stone was worth $45 million and felt absolutely nothing for another human being. Her daily routine was flawlessly cold. 7 a.m. meetings where she fired employees without blinking. 8 a.m. decisions that destroyed competitors. $1-million lunches where she negotiated dirty contracts. Margaret had transformed trauma into calculated cruelty, becoming exactly what her uncle wanted, a machine without a heart. The intercom buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. "Mrs. Stone, your Uncle Richard is here for your 2 o'clock meeting." Margaret straightened her jacket and composed her face into its usual mask of indifference. But as she turned from the window, she caught one last glimpse of the blonde child below, and for just a moment, something deep inside her chest stirred. Something that felt dangerously like recognition. 6 months had passed since Margaret Stone's cold declaration of war against the orphan children who dared approach her building. But one ghost refused to disappear. The 8-year-old blonde girl who haunted Margaret's nightmares and daylight hours alike. Sophie Williams had no idea she was about to confront the greatest fear of one of Chicago's most powerful women. Living in the decaying St. Mary's orphanage under the iron fist of the sadistic director Helen Carter, Sophie was starving, wearing donated clothes 3 sizes too big, and shoes with holes that let in the November cold. But desperation had sharpened her young mind into something formidable. For weeks, Sophie had studied the security patterns of Stone Industries like a tiny spy. The orphanage was threatening to transfer the problem children to even worse places, and Sophie knew she had to act. At dawn on a freezing Tuesday morning, she slipped past the guards hidden among a group of executives, her small frame invisible beneath an oversized coat that dragged on the ground not 47 flights of stairs. Each step was agony for her malnourished legs, but Sophie climbed with the determination of a child who had nothing left to lose. Water dripped from her soaked coat as she finally reached the executive floor, her breath coming in desperate gasps. Margaret was in the middle of a crucial $50 million meeting with Japanese investors when her office door burst open. The sight that greeted her made her blood freeze in her veins. A tiny orphan girl, exactly the same age Margaret had been when her world collapsed, standing there like a living nightmare made manifest. Sophie's small hand trembled as she extended a crumpled piece of paper written in pencil. Sophie Williams, 8 years old. I can read, write, clean, and take care of babies. Please, any job will do. I promise not to cry and work very hard. Margaret's hands began to shake uncontrollably. The carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart for 32 years started cracking at the sight of this desperate child who looked so much like herself at 8 years old. Get out! Security! Margaret screamed, her voice breaking with panic disguised as rage. She had Sophie dragged out brutally in front of the horrified Japanese investors, who immediately canceled the $50 million deal, calling Margaret's behavior inhumane and psychotic. Alone in her office after the chaos, Margaret experienced her first panic attack in years. Her perfectly controlled world was spinning out of control because of one small, determined orphan who had somehow seen past her armor and touched the terrified 8-year-old still hiding inside the 40-year-old. Ice Queen. Sophie's innocent words echoed in Margaret's mind. I promise not to cry. The irony was devastating. Margaret hadn't cried in 32 years, yet this child's simple plea had almost broken her completely. 2 weeks after losing the $50 million deal, Margaret Stone found herself staring at spreadsheets without seeing numbers, canceling important meetings, and spending hours at her office window, searching for a glimpse of blonde hair among the street crowds below. For the first time in 32 years, her legendary focus had completely shattered. The image of Sophie Williams haunted her relentlessly. Those desperate blue eyes, the trembling hand holding that heartbreaking note, the way the child had looked at her with hope instead of fear. Margaret caught herself wondering if the girl was warm enough, if she had eaten, if she was even still alive. Mrs. Stone? Amanda Brooks, her loyal secretary of 15 years, knocked hesitantly. There's something you should know about the St. Mary's Orphanage. There's been a scandal that several politicians are trying to cover up. Margaret's head snapped up sharply. What kind of scandal? Amanda's voice dropped to a whisper. Multiple. Children have been found dead or missing. Abuse, neglect, and worse. The authorities are being paid to look the other way, but some journalists are asking questions. Something twisted painfully in Margaret's chest. Against every instinct of self-preservation she'd developed over 3 decades, she heard herself saying, "Get my car. I'm going there personally." The drive to St. Mary's Orphanage took 30 minutes through Chicago's deteriorating South Side. When Margaret stepped out of her black Mercedes, she looked completely out of place in her $1,000 suit among the crumbling buildings and broken streetlights. What she found inside destroyed every assumption she'd held about her carefully ordered world. Children sleeping on moldy mattresses in a basement, visible bruises and cuts, hollow eyes that spoke of horrors no child should endure. The director, Helen Carter, ran the place like a prison warden, treating children like disposable objects. In the basement, Margaret found Sophie huddled in a corner, protectively cradling 3 smaller children who were covered in fresh bruises. When Sophie looked up and saw Margaret standing there, instead of running away in fear, the child's face lit up with devastating trust. "You came back," Sophie whispered, her voice weak but filled with impossible hope. "I knew you weren't really mean. Tommy is very sick and needs medicine. I've been taking care of him, but I don't know how to help anymore." Margaret felt something crack wide open inside her chest, a pain so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. This 8-year-old child, barely surviving in hell, was still trying to protect others, just like her parents had done. Just like Margaret herself should have been doing all these years. Standing in that basement surrounded by suffering children, Margaret Stone realized the most terrifying truth of her life. Everything her uncle and aunt had told her was wrong. Her parents hadn't died because they were weak. They had died because they were exactly what the world needed more of, and she had become everything they would have fought against. 1 month later, Margaret Stone sat in her executive chair staring at adoption papers that Amanda had quietly prepared, documents that could make Sophie Williams legally hers. For the first time since her parents' funeral 32 years ago, tears streamed down Margaret's face. The Ice Queen was finally melting, and it terrified her more than any business deal ever had. The image of Sophie, protecting those bruised children in the basement, haunted every moment of Margaret's existence. That 8-year-old girl possessed the same selfless courage that had gotten David and Linda Stone killed. Yet Margaret found herself desperately wanting to nurture that beautiful spirit instead of destroying it. "I've lost my mind," Margaret whispered to her reflection in the office window. "But maybe being crazy is better than being dead inside." She had already fired her entire brutal security team and donated $1 million anonymously to improve conditions at St. Mary's. But she wanted more. She wanted Sophie home, safe, loved. The word love felt foreign on her tongue after decades of emotional starvation. The office door burst open without warning. Richard Stone, 64 and silver-haired, stormed in with his wife Eleanor close behind, their faces twisted with panic and rage. "Have you completely lost your mind, Margaret?" Richard's voice shook with barely controlled fury. "We heard about your little charity work. You're having a complete breakdown." Eleanor, 61 with perfectly styled gray hair and cold blue eyes, circled Margaret's desk like a predator. "Darling, you're sick. These orphan children are exactly what destroyed your parents. Have you forgotten how David and Linda ended up? Butchered like animals because they were weak and sentimental." Margaret stood slowly, feeling something new and powerful rising in her chest. Defiance. Maybe my parents weren't weak. Maybe they were the strongest people I've ever known. The words hung in the air like a threat. Richard's face went white, and Eleanor's hands began to tremble almost imperceptibly. "You're having a psychotic episode," Richard said, his voice taking on a desperate edge that Margaret had never heard before. "These parasitic children are poisoning your mind just like they poisoned your parents' judgment." "Judgment?" Margaret's voice grew stronger. "My parents helped children who had nothing. How is that poor judgment?" Eleanor moved closer, her voice becoming honey-sweet and manipulative. "Sweetheart, you're forgetting the trauma. Remember how scared you were that night? Remember hiding in the closet while those criminals connected to the orphanages murdered your parents in cold blood?" But something had shifted fundamentally in Margaret's mind. The basement of St. Mary's had shown her what real evil looked like, and it wasn't an 8-year-old girl asking for help. It was adults who hurt children and called it strength. "I'm adopting Sophie Williams," Margaret announced, her voice carrying the same authority she used to destroy business competitors. "And there's nothing you can do to stop me." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard and Eleanor exchanged a look that Margaret couldn't interpret, but for the first time, she saw something that looked suspiciously like fear in their eyes. That evening, Margaret drove to St. Mary's with flowers and a teddy bear, her heart racing with anticipation. But Helen Carter met her at the door with a cold smile. "I'm sorry, Miss Stone, but Sophie Williams was transferred this morning to a specialized facility in another state. Emergency placement due to behavioral issues." Margaret's Blood turned to ice. What behavioral issues? She was protecting other children. The transfer was arranged by your family's legal representatives. They felt it was in everyone's best interest. Standing in the doorway of the orphanage, Margaret finally understood the game being played. Her uncle and aunt hadn't just shaped her into a weapon against her own nature. They were actively working to keep her isolated from anything that might heal her. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had let her see Sophie Williams. And now Margaret Stone knew what love felt like again. She would find that little girl if it was the last thing she ever did. 3 months after Sophie's mysterious disappearance, Margaret hired the best private investigators money could buy, spending $800,000 tracking leads across 17 states. But every trail went cold, every official record had been mysteriously sealed, and every contact led to dead ends that reeked of corruption and money. What Margaret didn't know was that Richard, Eleanor, and her ambitious 35-year-old cousin James Stone were orchestrating the most elaborate cover-up of their lives. They had spent 32 years carefully constructing Margaret's psychological prison, and now their greatest fear was coming true. She was breaking free in Richard's study, surrounded by family portraits that mocked their current desperation. The 3 conspirators planned Margaret's destruction with clinical precision. "She's getting too close to the truth," Richard paced frantically, his usually composed demeanor cracking. "If she keeps digging, she'll discover what really happened to David and Linda. We'll all end up in prison for murder." Eleanor's hands shook as she poured another glass of brandy. The orphan story was perfect for 32 years. How could one pathetic little girl undo everything we built? James, ever the opportunist, spread documents across the mahogany desk. "I've been working with Charles Morrison, that corrupt lawyer downtown. We can have Margaret declared mentally incompetent. I've got 3 psychiatrists ready to testify she's having a psychotic break with dangerous obsessions." "But what about the girl?" Eleanor's voice was sharp with panic. "Sophie Williams is the trigger that's unraveling Margaret's programming." Richard's smile was cold and calculating. "I've already handled that problem. Marcus Webb, the director of Hope Children's Home in Houston, has been paid $50,000 to make Sophie's life a living hell. Isolation, starvation, psychological torture, whatever it takes to break her spirit completely." The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Destroy Margaret's sanity through legal manipulation, while simultaneously crushing the child who had awakened her dormant humanity. If Margaret tried to find Sophie, she would discover a broken, traumatized girl who no longer resembled the hopeful child who had changed her life. "And if Margaret doesn't give up?" James asked, already knowing the answer. Richard's eyes went dead cold. "Then we'll do to her exactly what we did to her parents. Some secrets are worth killing for." Meanwhile, 800 miles away in Houston, 8-year-old Sophie Williams sat in a windowless room in the basement of Hope Children's Home, clutching a piece of paper where she had written Margaret Stone over and over again. She hadn't eaten a full meal in weeks, hadn't seen sunlight in a month, and endured daily punishments designed to make her forget the woman who had shown her kindness. But Sophie's spirit remained unbroken. In the darkness, she whispered prayers to a God she hoped was listening. "Please keep Margaret safe from the bad people. She's not mean. She's just scared. Help her remember that love is stronger than fear." Back in Chicago, Margaret received devastating news from her lead investigator. The adoption proceedings had been blocked by a court order, claiming she was mentally unstable and unfit for child custody. Her own family had orchestrated her legal destruction while she had been focused on finding Sophie. Standing in her empty penthouse, Margaret finally understood the true scope of the game being played. This wasn't just about one orphaned child. This was about keeping her isolated from anything that might restore her humanity. For 32 years, she had been a puppet dancing to strings she couldn't see, but puppets could cut their own strings. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed her lawyer. "Robert, I need you to investigate my uncle Richard Stone and everything connected to my parents' murder in 1992. And I mean everything: financial records, police reports, witness statements. Someone has been lying to me for 3 decades, and I'm going to find out who." The war for Margaret Stone's soul had begun, and this time she was fighting back. 6 months after Sophie's disappearance, Margaret's world collapsed with surgical precision. The Stone family conspiracy worked flawlessly. She lost control of Stone Industries. In a rigged board meeting where 8 corrupted members voted against her 3 loyal supporters, her $45 million in personal assets were frozen under allegations of mental instability and financial irresponsibility, leaving her powerless and broke. The manufactured evidence was overwhelming: forged psychiatric evaluations claiming Margaret suffered from dangerous obsessive-compulsive disorder with orphan fixation, fabricated witness testimonies about her erratic and threatening behavior, and medical reports declaring her a danger to herself and vulnerable children. James Stone stepped into the CEO position with mock reluctance, addressing the board with perfectly rehearsed concern. "My cousin Margaret needs intensive psychological treatment. We must protect both her and the company from her deteriorating mental state." Margaret stood in the boardroom she had dominated for 15 years, watching her life's work being stolen by the very people who had shaped her into their weapon. The irony was devastating. They had created the perfect corporate predator, and now they were devouring her with the same ruthless tactics she had once used on others. "You can't do this," Margaret whispered, but her voice carried no authority. The legal documents were airtight, the psychiatric evaluations unassailable, and the board members had already been bought. Eleanor smiled with false sympathy. "Darling, this is for your own good. You'll thank us when you're healthy again." Within days, Margaret was evicted from her $3 million penthouse and found herself in a cramped $800 apartment in Chicago's most dangerous neighborhood. The woman who once commanded corporate empires now worked as a night shift janitor in the same buildings she had previously owned, a humiliation carefully orchestrated to break her spirit completely. Her new reality was brutal: 12-hour shifts, cleaning toilets for minimum wage, eating ramen noodles and discounted bread, wearing second-hand clothes from Goodwill. But Margaret endured every degradation because it brought her closer to understanding the desperation Sophie must have felt living in the orphanage. Every paycheck, a pathetic $2,400 monthly, went toward continuing her search for Sophie. Margaret traveled by Greyhound bus to follow leads, slept in her car to save money on hotels, and survived on gas station sandwiches. A pampered executive had been stripped away, revealing someone Margaret barely recognized, someone who looked suspiciously like her parents. After 3 weeks of surveillance, Margaret finally located Hope Children's Home in Houston. Marcus Webb, a grossly overweight man with dead eyes, blocked her entry with practiced cruelty. "No Sophie Williams here," he lied smoothly, pocketing another envelope of cash from Richard Stone. "Try the state database. And don't come back here causing trouble." But that night, Margaret hid in her rusted car across the street and saw something that nearly destroyed her: a thin blonde figure in a basement window, barely visible behind security bars. Sophie was there, probably starving and definitely suffering, while Margaret was powerless to help, sleeping in her car and eating once a day to save money. Margaret began experiencing strange flashbacks about the night her parents died. Details that had never made sense suddenly seemed important. Why had the criminals known exactly where the family safe was hidden? Why had Richard and Eleanor arrived at the house only 10 minutes after the attack? Why had no evidence of these orphanage-connected criminals ever been found? For the first time in 32 years, Margaret Stone began to suspect that everything she had been told about her parents' death was a carefully constructed lie. And if her uncle and aunt had lied about that, what else had they fabricated to control her? Sitting in her broken-down car, watching the building where Sophie was being tortured, Margaret made a vow that would have made her parents proud. I will find the truth, and I will save that little girl, even if it destroys me completely. The transformation from Ice Queen to Broken Woman was nearly complete. Soon, Margaret would discover that breaking was exactly what she needed to become whole again. 1 year and 6 months after losing everything, Margaret Stone was unrecognizable. From the corporate Ice Queen who had once terrorized Chicago's business elite. At 41, she was 20 pounds thinner, her designer clothes replaced by thrift store uniforms, her manicured hands now cracked and calloused from manual labor. Working 3 jobs to survive became Margaret's new reality: cleaning office buildings from midnight to 6 a.m. for $800 monthly, serving coffee and burgers at Danny's Diner from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. for $900, and stocking shelves at Walmart from 4 p.m. to midnight for $700. 16 hours of daily labor left her exhausted, but Margaret never stopped searching for Sophie. During her 4 hours of fragmented sleep, nightmares plagued her with increasing clarity. The masked men who had supposedly killed her parents were becoming more recognizable in her dreams, their voices familiar, their movements hauntingly similar to people she knew. Margaret would wake up screaming, cold sweat covering her body as suppressed memories fought to surface. On weekends, Margaret volunteered at local orphanages, documenting abuse and building relationships with social workers who trusted her growing expertise in child welfare. Through these connections, she discovered a horrifying national network of corruption connecting orphanages, politicians, and wealthy families who used children as disposable commodities. The most devastating discovery came when Margaret found old city records showing that Stone Industries had profited millions from urban development projects that specifically targeted and demolished orphanages and community centers, exactly the places her parents had fought to protect. Her own company had been systematically destroying everything David and Linda Stone had died defending. Julia Martinez, a sympathetic social worker in Houston, called Margaret with heartbreaking news. Sophie Williams is in critical condition. She weighs only 35 pounds at 9 years old and has developed a severe cough that sounds like pneumonia. The facility claims she's accident-prone, but those injuries look intentional. Margaret collapsed in the Walmart break room, her minimum wage paycheck clutched in her shaking hands. She had exactly $300 in her bank account, number car, no influence, and no legal standing to help the child who had saved her soul. But in that moment of absolute despair, Margaret experienced a revelation that changed everything. Sophie had survived 18 months of torture while maintaining enough hope to write imaginary letters on scraps of stolen paper. Letters Julia had secretly photographed and sent to Margaret. Dear Margaret, one note read in childish handwriting, today I protected a baby who cries all night. He reminds me of you when you were little and scared. I know you're fighting the bad people to find me. Don't give up. Love is stronger than fear, just like you taught me. Reading Sophie's words, Margaret realized the child had never seen her as the monster she'd believed herself to be. Even during that first terrifying encounter in the corporate office, Sophie had recognized something in Margaret that Margaret herself had forgotten. The frightened 8-year-old girl who had watched her parents die for helping children exactly like Sophie. With trembling fingers, Margaret spent her last $300 on a bus ticket to Houston. She was going to break into Hope Children's home and rescue Sophie, even if it meant imprisonment or death. Some things were worth risking everything for, and love, real, pure, sacrificial love, was the strongest force in the universe. Margaret Stone was finally ready to become the person her parents had raised her to be, before fear and lies had turned her into something else entirely. 6 months later, Margaret's relentless investigation finally attracted the attention of David Chun, an investigative journalist from the Chicago Tribune who specialized in exposing institutional corruption. Margaret's meticulously documented evidence, secret recordings of her uncle's conversations, suspicious financial transfers, records of systematic bribery, painted a picture of conspiracy so vast it shocked even the seasoned reporter. "This goes deeper than child abuse," David told Margaret during their clandestine meeting in a downtown diner. "Your family has been running a criminal empire for decades, using orphanages as cover for money laundering, human trafficking, and political manipulation." What David discovered next made Margaret's blood run cold. Police records from 1992 showed that Richard and Eleanor Stone had been under FBI investigation for massive fraud in the exact same time frame when David and Linda Stone were murdered. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was calculated. "Margaret." David's voice was gentle but devastating. "There were no criminals connected to orphanages. The men who killed your parents were hired assassins. Your uncle and aunt orchestrated your parents' murder to steal the family inheritance and eliminate the witnesses to their crimes." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. For 32 years, she had been programmed by her parents. Killers shaped into a weapon against everything her mother and father had stood for. The criminals she had feared her entire life were sitting at family dinners, calling her darling, and collecting profits from her emotional destruction. Margaret's hands shook as she processed the magnitude of the deception. "They turned me into everything my parents fought against. They made me complicit in the very system that killed them." Dr. Rebecca Foster, a forensic psychologist who agreed to evaluate Margaret pro bono after reading David's preliminary articles, delivered the final blow to the family's fabricated narrative. After extensive testing, Dr. Foster concluded that Margaret showed no signs of mental illness whatsoever. The psychiatric reports were completely falsified. "You've been subjected to 3 decades of systematic psychological abuse," Dr. Foster explained during their session. "Your uncle and aunt used sophisticated manipulation techniques to keep you isolated from your own empathy. But the fact that you broke free when you met Sophie proves your core humanity was never truly destroyed." The breakthrough came when Amanda Brooks, Margaret's former secretary, finally surrendered to guilt that had been eating her alive for years. In a secret meeting at a suburban coffee shop, Amanda played a recording that shattered Margaret's world completely. "I recorded this conversation in 1995, Amanda whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I was cleaning Richard's office late, one night when he and Eleanor thought they were alone. The recording was scratchy, but clear enough. Richard's voice, younger but unmistakably his. Margaret is completely under control now. She'll never question what happened to David and Linda. The girl actually believes we saved her from the same criminals who killed her parents. It's perfect. We eliminated the bleeding hearts and turned their daughter into our greatest asset." Eleanor's laughter was like ice breaking. "Sometimes I almost feel sorry for her. Asterisk. She has no idea she's been working for her parents' murderers all these years." Margaret listened to the recording 3 times before the full impact hit her. She wasn't just a victim of psychological manipulation. She was the daughter of murdered heroes who had dedicated their lives to protecting children exactly like Sophie Williams. With this evidence, Margaret secured representation from Robert Jackson, a renowned attorney who specialized in prosecuting organized crime. For the first time in 18 months, Margaret felt something more powerful than despair flowing through her veins. Righteous fury, fueled by love for her murdered parents and her missing daughter. The war was no longer about survival. It was about justice, truth, and proving that love could triumph over the most sophisticated evil imaginable. Sophie was out there somewhere, and Margaret Stone was finally ready to bring her home. 3 months after Margaret discovered the truth about her parents' murder, Richard, Eleanor, and James Stone realized their 32-year conspiracy was unraveling. David Shun's investigative series, Lost Children, The Orphanage Mafia, was gaining national attention, and Margaret's evidence was building an airtight case for multiple homicide charges. Desperate to silence their greatest threat, the Stone family made the same choice they had made in 1992, eliminate the problem permanently. On a fog-covered Tuesday morning, Margaret's 15-year-old Honda Civic was sideswiped by a speeding truck that ran a red light and disappeared into traffic. The impact sent her car spinning into a concrete barrier at 40 miles per hour, shattering her left leg and causing severe head trauma that left her unconscious for 18 hours. Brake failure, the police report claimed, despite David Shun's insistence that the brake lines had been cut with professional precision. Margaret woke up in Chicago General Hospital with a steel rod in her leg, 37 stitches in her scalp, and a concussion that made thinking feel like swimming through molasses. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the news Julia Martinez delivered while Margaret was still in intensive care, connected to machines that monitored her failing body. "Margaret, there's been an incident in Houston." Julia's voice was barely a whisper. "Sophie tried to escape from Hope Children's home during the blizzard last week. She was found unconscious on Highway 45, 3 miles from the facility, suffering from severe hypothermia and pneumonia." Margaret's heart monitor began screaming as panic flooded her damaged system. "Where is she now? Is she alive?" "She's in critical condition at Houston Methodist Hospital, but..." Julia's pause felt like eternity. "Margaret, when they found her, she was walking toward Chicago. She told the paramedics she was trying to find you before the bad people hurt you." While Margaret lay broken in a hospital bed, Sophie Williams was fighting for her life 800 miles away, and the Stone family was orchestrating the final phase of their cover-up. Marcus Webb had been paid an additional $100,000 to make Sophie disappear permanently once she recovered. If she recovered, against medical advice and with a leg that screamed agony with every movement. Margaret discharged herself from the hospital after 2 days. She couldn't afford the medical bills, couldn't waste time healing while Sophie was dying, and couldn't trust that the Stone family wouldn't try to finish what they'd started. The 18-hour Greyhound bus ride to Houston was a journey through hell. Margaret's head throbbed with every pothole. Her broken leg swelled inside the cast, and she survived on pain medication and determination that bordered on supernatural. Other passengers stared at the pale, desperate woman who kept whispering, "Hold on, baby. Mama's coming." When Margaret finally reached Houston Methodist Hospital, she discovered her worst nightmare had come true. Sophie Williams had been transferred to a secure recovery facility by court order, another fabrication orchestrated by the Stone family's legal team. For 6 weeks, Margaret lived in her broken-down car in the hospital parking lot, showering, in gas station restrooms and eating vending machine food while searching every children's facility in a 3-state radius. She lost 20 more pounds, developed bleeding ulcers from stress and malnutrition, and came dangerously close to complete physical collapse. The breaking point came when Margaret found one of Sophie's letters hidden in her wallet, a note the child had secretly given her during their brief meeting at St. Mary's Orphanage. Written in careful pencil, it read, "Margaret, if you're reading this, it means the bad people separated us. But I know love is stronger than fear. Your parents would be proud of the brave woman you became. Don't give up on us." Sitting in her car in a Walmart parking lot, reading those words by the light of a street lamp, Margaret finally understood what Sophie had always known. This wasn't just about saving one orphan child. This was about honoring the memory of David and Linda Stone by becoming the parent they had raised her to be. a person she was meant to be before fear and lies had twisted her soul. Sophie Williams wasn't just the key to Margaret's redemption. She was Margaret's daughter in every way that mattered, and no force on earth would keep them apart forever. 8 months after their devastating separation, Margaret Stone received the phone call that would change everything. She was volunteering at the Austin Hope Center, coordinating searches for missing children, while living on donations and sleeping on the center's couch, when FBI agent Sarah Rodriguez delivered the news that stopped her heart. Ms. Stone, we've just completed a massive raid on an illegal operation in rural Texas. 47 children were rescued from deplorable conditions, and one of them has been asking for you specifically. Margaret's knees buckled as Agent Rodriguez continued. She's about 10 years old, blonde hair cut very short, distinctive scar on her forehead, and she's been drawing the same picture obsessively. A woman in a business suit crying. She keeps saying one name, Margaret. The drive to the temporary shelter felt like the longest hour of Margaret's life. Her hands shook so violently, she could barely grip the steering wheel of the donated car she'd been using. After 2 years of searching, of enduring poverty and violence and despair, Sophie was alive. Damaged, certainly, but alive. When Margaret entered the children's safe house, she saw dozens of rescued kids receiving medical attention and counseling. But her eyes found Sophie immediately, even though the child was almost unrecognizable. The vibrant 8-year-old who had burst into her office was now a gaunt 10-year-old with hollow cheeks, arms marked by healing scars, and hair hacked short in uneven chunks. Sophie was sitting alone at a small table, methodically drawing with crayons, when Margaret whispered, "Sophie? Baby, it's me. It's your Margaret?" The child's hand froze over the paper. Very slowly, as if afraid she was hallucinating, Sophie turned around. For 30 seconds they felt like eternity. They just stared at each other. The broken woman who had lost everything searching for this child, and the traumatized girl who had survived hell by believing in that love. Then Sophie's face crumpled, and she launched herself into Margaret's arms with a sob that came from the depths of her soul. "I knew, IT. I knew you would never give up. I told them every day that my Margaret was coming." Margaret held Sophie as if she would never let go, both of them crying with relief and joy and heartbreak for all the time they'd lost. "I'm so sorry, baby girl. I'm so sorry it took me so long to find you. Forgive Mama for letting them hurt you." Sophie pulled back just enough to look into Margaret's eyes with that devastating wisdom that had always defined her. "You didn't let them hurt me. You fought them every single day. I could feel you looking for me, even when I was scared and hungry and cold. That's what kept me strong." Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the trauma specialist working with the rescued children, watched the reunion with tears in her eyes. "In 20 years of working with abused children, I've never seen anything like this. Sophie never stopped talking about you. She credits you with saving her life, even during the worst moments." Margaret learned that Sophie had been moved between 3 different illegal facilities over 18 months, each one worse than the last. She had been starved, isolated, and psychologically tortured by people paid by the Stone family to break her spirit completely. But through it all, Sophie had protected younger children, shared her meager food rations, and maintained hope by drawing pictures of the day she would see Margaret again. "They told me you didn't want me anymore," Sophie whispered against Margaret's shoulder. "They said you were crazy and forgot about me. But I knew they were lying, because love doesn't forget." Margaret's voice broke as she made the most important promise of her life. "Baby, I will never leave you again. Never. We're going to be a real family now, and nothing in this world will separate us." Sophie smiled through her tears with that impossible resilience that had always amazed Margaret. "I already know we're a real family. We chose each other when it was hard, so that means it's the strongest kind of love there is." As they held each other in that sterile government facility, Margaret finally understood that this moment wasn't just about finding Sophie. It was about finding herself. The frightened, manipulated woman was gone forever, replaced by someone who would fight the entire world to protect the child who had saved her soul. 3 months after their miraculous reunion, Margaret and Sophie's world transformed from nightmare to dream as justice finally began to unfold. The FBI's investigation into the illegal children's facilities led directly to the Stone family conspiracy, unraveling 32 years of murder, fraud, and systematic child abuse. Richard Stone, 71 and frail, was arrested at his country club during a golf game. Eleanor Stone was taken into custody while shopping at Nordstrom, her designer purse containing evidence of recent bribes to silence witnesses. James Stone tried to flee to Switzerland, but was apprehended at O'Hare Airport with $2 million in cash and fake passports. The media circus was unprecedented. Margaret Stone's transformation from ruthless CEO to child advocate captured the nation's imagination, while Sophie's survival story inspired millions of people who had given up hope on their own broken dreams. The Stone family has been charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, human trafficking, money laundering, and crimes against 47 children over a span of 3 decades, announced federal prosecutor Maria Gonzalez during a nationally televised press conference. This case represents one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises ever uncovered. Margaret received a settlement of $15 million from Stone Industries, now under federal administration, as compensation for 32 years of psychological manipulation and the crimes committed against her and Sophie. But money meant nothing compared to the treasure sleeping in the bedroom next to hers. Their new home was a spacious 5-bedroom house in Austin with a large backyard where Sophie could run and play safely. Margaret had chosen Austin specifically because of its excellent trauma counseling services and the supportive community at the Hope Center, where she now worked as executive director. Sophie's healing process was slow but miraculous. Dr. Rebecca Foster, who had relocated to Austin to continue working with them, marveled at the child's resilience during their family therapy sessions. Sophie has experienced severe trauma, but her core spirit remains intact. Dr. Foster explained to Margaret during a private consultation, "The love you two share is the most powerful therapeutic tool I've ever witnessed. She's healing because she feels completely safe with you." Sophie was enrolled at Riverside Academy, a specialized school for gifted children who had experienced trauma. Despite losing 2 years of formal education, Sophie tested at a 12th grade level in reading and mathematics, her intelligence sharpened by survival and nurtured by Margaret's patient tutoring. Their daily routines became sacred rituals of mutual healing. Mornings started with pancakes and discussions about dreams and nightmares, processing their trauma together with the honesty that only unconditional love makes possible. Sophie attended school while Margaret ran the foundation, but afternoons were devoted entirely to each other. "Margaret," Sophie said one evening while they painted her bedroom walls a cheerful yellow, "do you think your parents would be proud of us?" Margaret's brush paused as she considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Baby, I think they're dancing in heaven because their daughter finally became the woman they raised her to be, and because they have the most amazing granddaughter in the universe." Sophie beamed with pure joy. "I like thinking of them as my grandparents. Do you think they helped me find you?" "I know they did, sweet girl. Love like theirs never really dies. It just finds new ways to work miracles." The legal proceedings moved swiftly. Richard Stone, faced with overwhelming evidence, confessed to ordering the murders of David and Linda Stone in exchange for life in prison without parole. Eleanor and James received similar sentences for their roles in the conspiracy and the systematic abuse of hundreds of children. During the sentencing hearing, Sophie surprised everyone by asking to address the court. Standing at the witness podium, barely tall enough to reach the microphone, she spoke with the wisdom of someone far beyond her 10 years. "I forgive Mr. and Mrs. Stone for hurting me and my Mama Margaret," Sophie said clearly, her voice carrying throughout the silent courtroom. "Hate only makes more hurt. Can we choose love instead? But I hope they learn in prison that loving people is better than being scared of them." Margaret watched from the gallery, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the extraordinary grace of the child who had saved her soul and was now saving the souls of her enemies. 8 months after the trial that brought justice to the Stone family, Margaret and Sophie had created a life that honored both healing and purpose. Sophie, now 11 years old and thriving at Riverside Academy, had grown 3 inches and gained 15 healthy pounds. Her smile, once tentative and guarded, now lit up entire rooms with genuine joy. The David and Linda Stone Foundation had become a national powerhouse in child protection, with Margaret as executive director and Sophie as their youngest advisory board member. Operating from a gleaming headquarters in downtown Austin, they had already closed 23 corrupt orphanages across 8 states and facilitated over 400 safe adoptions. "Mama Margaret," Sophie said during their weekly foundation planning meeting, using the title she had chosen herself, "I think we should create a special program for kids who are too scared to trust adults. I remember what that felt like." Margaret marveled at how Sophie's trauma had transformed into wisdom instead of bitterness. At 11, she possessed an intuitive understanding of child psychology that amazed professional counselors and social workers. Their home life had settled into beautiful routines that nurtured both their healing and their happiness. Saturday mornings were sacred for pancakes and Disney movie marathons, while Sunday afternoons were devoted to visiting local children's shelters, where Sophie worked magic with traumatized kids who saw their own survival reflected in her eyes. "You know what's funny?" Sophie asked one evening while they baked cookies for the shelter kids. "I used to think being an orphan meant I was broken, but now I know it just means I'm really good at helping other kids who feel lost." Margaret stopped, mixing batter to embrace the remarkable young woman Sophie was becoming. "Baby girl, you were never broken. You were always perfect exactly as you were. You just needed someone to see your light." The foundation's work had attracted national attention, leading to Margaret's testimony before Congress about reforming the child welfare system. Sophie insisted on accompanying her, wanting to represent the voices of children who couldn't speak for themselves. During the congressional hearing, 11-year-old Sophie delivered a speech that brought seasoned politicians to tears. "Every kid deserves someone who will fight for them when they can't fight for themselves. My Mama Margaret taught me that families aren't just about blood. They're about choosing to love somebody every single day, especially when it's hard." Margaret watched from the witness table, overwhelmed with pride as Sophie fielded questions from senators with the poise of someone far beyond her years. This child, who had once been starving and desperate, was now influencing national policy and inspiring millions of people worldwide. Their personal traditions had become as important as their public work. Sophie was teaching Margaret origami techniques she had learned during her darkest days, while Margaret was teaching Sophie about financial management and strategic planning for the foundation's future. "I want to be a lawyer and a psychologist when I grow up," Sophie announced during dinner one night. "Lawyer so I can protect kids legally, and psychologist so I can help heal their hearts." Margaret had already established a $2 million education fund to ensure Sophie could pursue any dream she chose. But more importantly, she had given Sophie something no amount of money could buy: the unshakable knowledge that she was unconditionally loved. Their love story had become a beacon of hope for thousands of families created through adoption, proving that the strongest bonds are forged through choice rather than biology. 1 year after their lives found perfect harmony, Margaret and Sophie's bond had deepened into something that transcended traditional definitions of family. Sophie, now 12 years old and standing tall with confidence that radiated from within, had become Margaret's greatest teacher and closest friend. The David and Linda Stone Foundation had grown exponentially under their joint leadership. 127 employees across 15 states, responsible for closing 67 corrupt facilities and facilitating over 1,200 successful adoptions. Sophie's innovative Hope Protocol had revolutionized how social workers identified and rescued at-risk children. Margaret's autobiography, The Girl Who Taught Me to Love, How an 8-Year-Old Orphan Broke 32 Years of Fear, became a national bestseller. Earning $8.3 million, it was immediately donated to children's charities. Sophie had insisted on co-writing several chapters, her perspective adding depth that moved readers to action. "Mama," Sophie said during their evening walk through the memorial garden they had planted behind their house, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been brave enough to walk into your office that day?" Margaret considered the question seriously, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope. "Baby girl, I think God knew exactly what he was doing when he sent you to save me. You didn't just walk into my office. You walked into my heart and made it beat again." Sophie had been elected student body president at Riverside Academy by unanimous vote. Her platform, focusing on anti-bullying initiatives and mental health awareness. Her teachers marveled at her academic brilliance, straight A's in advanced courses and acceptance into a prestigious summer program for gifted young leaders. During a national television interview on 60 Minutes, Sophie delivered words that would be quoted for decades. "Family isn't about sharing blood. It's about sharing love every single day. My mama Margaret and I choose each other fresh every morning, and that makes our love stronger than anything that tried to break us." Margaret watched from the studio audience, tears of pride streaming down her face as she witnessed the transformation of the desperate child who had once begged for work into a young leader who would change the world. Their greatest achievement wasn't measured in dollars raised or policies changed, but in the simple miracle of their daily life together. Sophie teaching Margaret patience through origami lessons, Margaret teaching Sophie strategic thinking through foundation planning, both of them discovering that healing happens fastest when shared with someone who understands your scars. "You know what I love most about our story?" Sophie asked as they tucked themselves into bed, a routine they both cherished. "We proved that love always wins, even when evil people try really hard to stop it." Margaret kissed Sophie's forehead, whispering the same prayer of gratitude she offered every night. "Thank you, God, for sending me this perfect daughter to show me who I was always meant to be." 1 year later, Margaret at 44 and Sophie at 13 had created a rhythm of love they felt as natural as breathing. Their life flowed in perfect harmony. 4 days a week, Margaret led the foundation's national expansion, while 3 days were devoted entirely to Sophie's activities and their shared adventures. Sophie had blossomed into an extraordinary young woman, her trauma transformed into wisdom that inspired everyone she met. As the youngest person ever to address the International Children's Rights Summit, she spoke to delegates from 47 countries about systemic reform and healing. Every child deserves someone who will see their light even when they can't see it themselves, Sophie declared to thunderous applause. "My mama Margaret taught me that broken doesn't mean worthless. It means you understand how to help other people heal." Margaret watched from the audience, overwhelmed with pride as Sophie fielded questions from world leaders with grace beyond her years. This child, who had once begged for scraps, was now shaping global policy on child welfare. Their home had become a sanctuary for 28 adoptive families and a regular gathering place for 156 children whose lives had been touched by their foundation. Sophie insisted on hosting monthly hope parties, where rescued children could share their stories and support each other's healing. The personal traditions they'd created were as important as their public work. Sunday mornings meant pancakes and planning foundation projects together, while Saturday evenings were reserved for origami lessons and Margaret learning Sophie's secret recipes for cookies that taste like hope. "I've been thinking about my future," Sophie announced during their weekly mother-daughter dinner date. "I want to double major in law and psychology at Harvard and come back and expand our foundation internationally." Margaret had already secured Sophie's educational future with a $2 million trust fund. But more importantly, she had given her daughter something invaluable: absolute confidence in her own worth and potential. In a ceremony broadcast live across the nation, Margaret officially adopted Sophie, who chose the name Sophie Stone Williams to honor both her chosen mother and her own origins. The judge, visibly moved, declared, "In 35 years on the bench, I've never witnessed love more transformative than this," Sophie whispered to Margaret as they signed the final papers. "Now we're legally family forever, just like we've always been in our hearts." Margaret responded with tears of joy. "We were always meant to be together, sweetheart." The paperwork just makes it official for the world to see. Their love story had become proof that families built on choice and sacrifice are stronger than any bonds of blood, inspiring thousands of adoptive parents and children worldwide. As they walked hand in hand from the courthouse, Sophie smiled with that ancient wisdom that had always defined her. "Do you realize we just proved that love really can conquer anything, even 32 years of lies and fear?" Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand, knowing their greatest adventures were still ahead of them. 5 years after Sophie burst into Margaret's office and shattered 32 years of programmed fear, they stood together on the sidewalk where their miracle began. The former Stone Industries building now housed the David and Linda Stone National Center for Child Protection, a beacon of hope rising 47 stories into the Chicago sky. Sophie, now 13 and radiant with confidence, squeezed Margaret's hand as they gazed up at their memorial to 1,247 children who had died in abusive facilities. "Can you believe our story started right here, when I was so scared but pretended to be brave?" Margaret smiled through tears of gratitude. "You weren't pretending, baby girl. You were the bravest person I'd ever met." That 8-year-old saved a 40-year-old woman who was lost for decades. The culminating moment arrived when Sophie addressed the International Children's Rights Conference, receiving a 10-minute standing ovation from 5,000 delegates representing 47 countries. "Every child deserves someone who will fight for them when the whole world says it's impossible," Sophie declared with stunning poise. "My mama Margaret taught me that true love breaks chains of lies built by generations of fear. Sometimes a desperate child must enter a frightened adult's life to remind them who they really are." Margaret wept with pride watching her daughter inspire millions worldwide. After the speech, Sophie ran to embrace Margaret, whispering words that perfectly completed their journey. "Thank you for letting a scared little girl break down your walls, Mama. You saved me, but I think I saved you too." Margaret held Sophie's face tenderly. "You saved me first, my heart. You brought me back to life and taught me my parents were right. Love isn't weakness. It's the universe's greatest force." Sophie smiled with that timeless wisdom. "Now we'll spend forever saving other children, just like your parents did?" Margaret nodded, understanding this was life's true circle. "Yes, sweetheart. We'll honor David and Linda by showing the world that families born from pure love can heal even the deepest pain." Their final image was walking hand in hand through a memorial garden of 1,247 trees, each honoring a lost child. Golden sunset light created intertwined shadows, symbolizing two souls united by love's triumph.